Think about the last time you got into a heated argument. Your heart was pounding, your temperature rising, your words getting sharper. Now ask yourself, what did you actually win? Did the other person suddenly stop, admit you were right, and thank you for showing them the light? Or did you walk away feeling drained, frustrated, and with a relationship now slightly fractured? The truth is, every time you engage in a direct argument, you've already lost. You've lost energy, time, and strategic position. But what if there was a way to win every single debate without ever arguing again? This isn't about suppressing your opinions. It's about expressing them with such powerful, tactical precision that opposition simply crumbles. To master this, we turn to a ruthless fusion of two ancient schools of thought, the unshakable calm of Stoicism and the cunning strategic mind of Machiavelli. The core of this philosophy is a brutal strategic truth. Arguments are not won with logic, they are won with perception. Machiavelli understood this better than anyone. In The Prince, he didn't advise rulers to win philosophical debates. He advised them to win the hearts and minds of their people through calculated appearances. He knew that the appearance of power is power. The moment you engage in a heated public debate, you sacrifice that appearance. You descend from a position of calm control into the chaotic arena with your opponent. You have voluntarily stepped down to their level. Machiavelli would see this as a catastrophic strategic error. Your goal is not to prove you are right. Your goal is to be right and to be perceived as right, while your opponent is perceived as emotional and unstable. This is a game of appearances. Think of a king. Does a king ever yell at a peasant? No. He remains composed because his composure is a signal of his immense power. He doesn't need to argue. His very demeanor ends the debate before it begins. This is the first lesson. Never defend, never explain. To do so is to acknowledge the other person as your equal, as a worthy challenger to your throne. Your silence, your calm, your refusal to engage in their emotional game, these are your weapons. They are non-verbal commands that signal you are above the fray. This is where Stoicism provides the foundational strength. Stoicism teaches us that we cannot control external events, only our responses to them. Someone challenging your idea is an external event. Your emotional, heated reaction is a choice. The Stoic chooses a different response, calm indifference. This isn't apathy, it is strategic reserve. You are conserving your energy for what truly matters, action and influence. While your opponent is burning their credibility and social capital on a public outburst, you are preserving yours. You are making yours more valuable by the second. You are watching them exhaust themselves against the unmovable wall of your composure. This combination is devastatingly effective. The Machiavellian mind chooses the battlefield, and it is never a verbal shouting match. It is the silent, psychological arena of perception. The Stoic mind provides the inner fortitude to remain on that chosen battlefield without being baited into a fight you've already decided not to join. You win by not playing their game. But this is only the first layer. This Stoic composure isn't just a shield, it's a lens. It allows you to see the real reason the argument is happening. Machiavelli urges us to look beyond the surface. People argue rarely about the topic itself, and almost always about underlying needs. a need to be heard, a need for status, a need to win, a deep-seated insecurity. Your silence gives you the space to diagnose this true motivation. Is your boss arguing about your proposal because of its merits, or because he wasn't consulted first and feels his status was threatened? Is your partner nitpicking about a minor detail because of the detail, or because they feel a loss of control in another area of life? When you stop arguing the point, you start seeing the person. And once you see the real motivation, you can address it, not with a counter-argument, but with a strategic move. You can offer the recognition, the assurance, the respect that is actually being sought. This is how you win. You give them the underlying victory they crave, and in return, they grant you the concrete victory you need. You haven't argued. You've operated. You haven't fought. You've manipulated the very foundation of the conflict until it dissolved. This is the art. It's not about being right. It's about being effective. It's understanding that the greatest power lies not in the force of your voice, but in the depth of your silence and the precision of your subsequent actions. So, you've mastered the art of silence. You understand that to argue is to lose, and you've built the Stoic fortitude to remain calm when provoked. But what happens when silence isn't an option? When you must engage, when a decision must be made and your perspective is vital. This is where most strategic minds fail. They believe the choice is between explosive argumentation and passive silence. But there is a third, far more powerful path. It's not about avoiding the conflict. It's about redirecting it. It's about mastering the language of strategic assent, a concept that turns the energy of your opposition against itself. This is the next evolution, winning the argument without ever making your own case. The foundational tactic is a principle we can call agree to disarm. Imagine your opponent charges at you, full of force, ready for a fight. They state their position with absolute certainty. The natural, ego-driven response is to stand your ground and push back with equal force. This is a collision. And in a collision, even if you win, you are damaged. The Machiavellian Stoic does something completely counterintuitive. They step aside. They agree, not sincerely, but strategically. Your goal is not to prove their point wrong, but to make their point irrelevant. You do this by absorbing their energy and using it to fuel your own agenda. For example, if a colleague aggressively says, "This entire project is headed for disaster, and your plan is the reason why," the weak person argues. The strategic person responds with, "You're right to be concerned about the project's success. That's my primary concern as well." The potential for disaster is exactly why we need a methodical approach. Do you see what happened? You didn't agree with their accusation, but you agreed with their underlying emotion, concern. You have validated their emotional state, which immediately disarms their hostility. You have reframed the conflict from you versus them into you-them versus the problem. This is a psychological judo throw. You have used their own momentum to move them onto your chosen battlefield. This is where Stoic control over your own ego is paramount. Your pride will scream at you to defend yourself, to prove them wrong. You must let that impulse die. See it as a weakness to be conquered. From a Machiavellian perspective, your pride is a liability. It is a lever your enemies can use to control you. By mastering your ego, you remove that lever. You become immune to provocation. This allows you to perform the strategic agreement not as a pathetic act of submission, but as a calculated move of a grand master positioning pieces on a chessboard. You are not conceding. You are recruiting. You are verbally aligning yourself with them to ultimately guide them to your conclusion. The second part of this tactic is the yes and principle. You take their point, which you have just agreed with, and you add a clause that expands it in the direction you want it to go. Yes, you're absolutely right that we need to be cautious with the budget, and that caution is precisely why investing in this one area will save us significant costs down the line. You are not arguing, you are building. You are using their own foundation, their stated concern, to construct the house of your own argument. They cannot knock it down without knocking down their own initial premise. This entire process transforms you from a debater into a diagnostician and a director. You are no longer interested in the surface-level words. You are listening for the root cause of the resistance. Is it fear? Is it a desire for control? Is it a lack of information? Your agreement is the anesthetic that allows you to perform the surgery. You calm the patient, your opponent, by validating their fear. I'd be fearful too if I thought that. Then, once they are calm and listening, you implant the new idea. This is manipulation in its purest, most effective form. You are not forcing your will. You are aligning their will with your own, making them believe the desired outcome was their idea all along. They walk away feeling heard, respected, and victorious. You walk away having achieved your exact objective without a single drop of social capital spent, without a single relationship damaged. You haven't defeated an enemy, you've gained a willing ally. This is the supreme irony of power. Sometimes the fastest way to win is to never fight at all, but to instead guide the hands of those who would oppose you and lead them to your door. You have learned to stand firm in silence and to redirect opposition through strategic agreement. These skills make you a formidable opponent, but they are ultimately defensive and manipulative in nature. To truly wield power, you must graduate from managing conflicts. This is the level of the true master, the art of controlling the board itself. It's about engineering the environment, the perceptions, and the very options available to others, so that they naturally and willingly choose the path you have pre-selected for them. This isn't about winning an argument. It's about making the argument unnecessary. The first tool in this architectural phase is the strategic framing of choices. You must never present your desired outcome as a single, stark option to be accepted or rejected. That is an invitation for debate. Instead, you must always present it as one of 2 or 3 possible paths, and you must carefully design the alternatives. Machiavelli understood that a prince must often control the nobility not by force, but by presenting them with options where every choice ultimately serves his interests. Here's how you do it. You frame option A, your desired outcome, against option B, a deliberately less palatable alternative. Option B isn't ridiculous. It must be plausible, but it should be clearly inferior, perhaps more expensive, more time-consuming, or more risky. You might even include an option C, a decoy that is so complex or unappealing it makes option A shine by comparison. You are not arguing for your idea. You are simply laying out the landscape. You are the impartial presenter of facts. This is where your Stoic detachment becomes your greatest asset. You deliver the options without emotional investment, making the entire process seem objective and fair. The other person engages their critical thinking on which option to choose, not whether to choose your way. You have bypassed their resista. Not entirely. They believe they are exercising their free will, making an independent choice, while you have quietly designed the menu from which they are ordering. This leads to the second, more profound concept: controlling the context. An argument is a single battle. The context is the entire war. Before you ever enter a discussion, you must have already shaped the context in which that discussion will occur. If you are going to propose a new business strategy, you don't just present it in a meeting. Weeks before, you begin controlling the narrative. You might share articles or data points that highlight the problem your strategy solves. You might have casual, one-on-one conversations where you seed the core idea, not as a proposal, but as an interesting thought. I was reading something fascinating the other day about how Company X handled a similar issue. By the time you formally present your strategy, it doesn't feel new or foreign to your audience. It feels familiar. It feels like a logical conclusion to a conversation that has already been happening. You have made the environment fertile for your idea to grow. Any opposition now has to fight not just against you, but against a pre-established, favorable consensus. They are arguing against the room itself. This is the pinnacle of Machiavellian Stoic fusion. The Machiavellian provides the cunning to design these frames and control the context. The Stoic provides the patience and the emotional discipline to execute this long game without tipping your hand. There is no room for ego here. You don't need public credit for the idea. In fact, it is often more powerful to let others believe it was ultimately their idea. Your satisfaction comes from the outcome, not the applause. This is the ultimate manipulation because it is invisible. There is no moment of confrontation to point to. There is only a series of seemingly natural progressions that lead to your desired destination. You become like water, flowing around obstacles, gently shaping the landscape over time. You are not a debater. You are a designer. You don't win arguments. You make them obsolete. Your power doesn't come from being the loudest voice in the room, but from having quietly designed the room itself, its acoustics, ensuring your voice is the one that is heard most clearly. We have navigated the defensive power of silence, the redirectional force of strategic agreement, and the architectural control of framing choices. These skills transform you from a reactive participant into a strategic influencer. But they all lead to this final, ultimate question. To what end? What is the purpose of this power? This is where our fusion finds its highest expression. It is not for petty victories or the accumulation of power for its own sake. The true master uses these skills not just to win, but to build something unshakable. This is the final chapter, moving from manipulation to legacy, from tactics to sovereignty. Your goal is to become so effective that you transcend the need for constant manipulation and instead command a permanent and unassailable position of influence. The first step in this evolution is the calculated display of value. Machiavelli observed that a prince must be feared rather than loved if he cannot be both. But in the modern world, this translates to a different currency: indispensable value. Your power becomes permanent when your value to others is so clear, so undeniable, that opposing you comes at a tremendous cost. This isn't about boasting, it's about demonstrating. You make your skills, your network, your calm under pressure, and your strategic mind so valuable that losing access to you is a worse fate than occasionally conceding to you. You become the go-to person for solutions. You are the one who navigates complex situations, who brokers peace, who sees 3 moves ahead. This reputation is your armor. People do not argue with their most valuable asset. They protect it. They listen to it. This is built through consistent, visible action. Every time you use Stoic composure to avert a disaster, every time you use Machiavellian framing to secure a win for your entire team, you are not just winning a battle. You are depositing credibility into your reputation bank. Over time, the compound interest on these deposits makes you psychologically wealthy beyond measure. This leads to the cornerstone of sovereignty, the principle of unbreakable optionality. The ultimate power in any negotiation, any relationship, any conflict is the power to walk away. But this isn't a dramatic, emotional threat. It is a quiet, factual reality that you have built for yourself through deliberate action. You have nurtured a strong network outside your immediate circle. You have developed skills that are in high demand. You have financial reserves. You have a rich inner life governed by Stoic principles that is not dependent on external validation. Because of this, you are never truly trapped. You always have options. This changes everything. When you know, deep down, that you can walk away from any deal, any job, any argument, and be perfectly fine, that energy radiates from you. It is the energy of true freedom. People sense it instinctively. They understand that you are not negotiating from a place of desperation, but from a place of choice. This makes your presence calming and your suggestions weighty. You argue less because you need less. You are not trying to win something from them. You are offering them the opportunity to collaborate with you. This is an offer they instinctively feel is valuable and rare. Finally, we are at the summit, the sovereign mind. This is the full integration of Machiavellian strategy and Stoic philosophy. The sovereign mind is no longer using tactics situationally. It has become tactical in its very nature. Its default state is calm, observant, and strategic. It sees the world not as a series of personal challenges, but as a complex chessboard of motivations and potentials. It feels no need to announce its power, because its power is evident in its results. It has moved beyond the need for petty manipulation, because it operates on a level where it shapes realities. The sovereign mind understands that the highest form of power is creation, not domination. It uses its strategic grasp of human nature to build teams, forge alliances, create projects, and nurture environments that are productive, powerful, and resilient. It argues only for sport, never for need. It wins because it has designed the game, and it designed the game not to defeat others, but to allow everyone who plays it to elevate themselves, thereby elevating the sovereign in turn. This is the final, beautiful paradox. By mastering the art of never arguing, you don't just win every argument, you transcend the very concept of argument itself. You become a force of nature, calm, immovable, and endlessly effective. Your legacy isn't the debates you won, but the world you built, a world where your influence is so seamlessly woven into the fabric of things that it simply becomes the way things are. This journey from reactive debater to strategic sovereign isn't about learning a few tricks. It's about a fundamental rewiring of how you move through the world. It's a fusion of ancient wisdom that grants you unshakable calm and undeniable influence. If these ideas have shifted your perspective, if you can see a new path to navigate your daily interactions with more power and less friction, then you've felt the first step of this transformation. This channel is dedicated to deconstructing these powerful philosophies and turning them into practical tools you can use every day. To continue this journey with us, and to ensure you don't miss the next step in mastering your own potential, make sure to subscribe. If this video added value to your life, liking it helps this content reach others who are ready to stop arguing and start winning. And sharing it begins to practice these very principles, extending your influence by providing undeniable value to your own network. Thank you for watching.